I'm 73 years old, and I've never been good at talking about myself. My daughter, Sarah, used to say that was my biggest flaw, that I kept things locked up inside like they were contraband, too dangerous to expose to daylight. Maybe she was right. Maybe if I'd been better at words, at explanations, at letting her see the full picture of what happened back in 1981, things wouldn't have festered between us for 40 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The truth is, I'm sitting in a hospital waiting room right now, filling out pre-op paperwork for heart surgery scheduled in 3 days. My hands are shaking, not from fear of the surgery itself, but because of what I did last night, what I finally forced myself to do. And I need to tell you the whole story, because if something goes wrong on that operating table, I don't want this truth dying with me. Part 1, the man I've always been. Let me start with who I am. I'm not a complicated man, never have been. I work with my hands, or I did anyway. Spent 45 years as a general contractor in Northern California, building houses, renovating kitchens, fixing roofs. That kind of work doesn't require much conversation. You show up, you measure twice, you cut once, and you move forward. There's honesty in that kind of work. A wall either stands or it doesn't. You can't argue with gravity or physics. I grew up in Oakland, son of an Irish immigrant father and a mother whose family came from Kentucky coal country. My father was a stevedore down at the docks. My mother did laundry and cleaning work for wealthy families in the hills. Neither of them finished high school. Neither of them expected much from life, except that it should be honest and that you should work hard and treat people the way you wanted to be treated. Simple codes. I was the third of 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. Our house was always loud, always full, always a little chaotic. We didn't have much money, but we had each other, and that seemed like enough. My father died when I was 16, a loading accident at the docks, one of those things that happens too quickly to prevent, too suddenly to understand. After that, I left school and started working construction with my oldest brother, Tommy. I was 17. By the time I was 25, I'd saved enough to strike out on my own. Moved up to the Bay Area, started taking on small jobs, and slowly built a reputation as someone who showed up on time, did good work, and didn't cut corners. That reputation meant something. It was my currency. It was who I was. I met Margaret at a hardware store in 1977. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But she was there looking for paint chips for an apartment she was renting, and I was there picking up supplies for a kitchen renovation. She was standing at the paint sample display, holding up about 15 different shades of off-white and blue, trying to figure out which one would look good with a particular set of curtains she'd already purchased. I watched her for maybe 30 seconds while she concentrated, her forehead all scrunched up in that adorable way people's faces get when they're trying to solve something that really doesn't matter. "The blue," I said, just like that, one word. She turned and looked at me like I'd appeared from nowhere. "What?" she asked. "The blue, it'll make the room feel bigger, make the light from the window more noticeable." I have no idea why I said that. I'd never paid attention to interior design a day in my life, but something about her made me want to offer her something, some small piece of certainty in her moment of indecision. She smiled. She had this smile that started small at the corners of her mouth and gradually spread across her whole face like sunrise. "You know something about paint." "Not particularly," I admitted, "but I know something about how light works in spaces, and the blue's going to show it off better." She bought the blue, and she also, at my awkward suggestion, gave me her phone number. Margaret was different from anyone I'd ever met. She'd grown up upper middle class in San Francisco, the daughter of a banker and a society woman. Her family expected her to go to Stanford, major in something sensible, marry someone from a good family. She'd done the Stanford part, graduated with a degree in art history, but then she'd sort of rebelled by moving into a modest apartment, working part-time as a curator's assistant at a small museum, and refusing all of her mother's attempts at matchmaking. She was 24 when I met her. I was 28 and felt ancient by comparison. We dated for 2 years. I was cautious, not because I didn't like her, but because I was aware that her world and my world didn't really overlap. Her family made more in a year than I'd ever make. They took vacations to Europe. They belonged to clubs. They'd never had to worry about money or work, but Margaret had a kind of authenticity that I respected. She wasn't pretentious. She genuinely loved art and beauty and learning, not as status symbols, but as actual sources of joy. When I asked her to marry me, I did it properly. I saved for 6 months to buy a ring that wasn't huge, but was real and was mine, paid for by my work. I proposed in the apartment she'd rented, on the same couch where she'd first shown me the blue paint on the walls. She said yes so fast, I almost missed it. We got married in 1979 at City Hall, with my brother Tommy and Margaret's best friend Diane as witnesses. Margaret's parents didn't come. They'd threatened to disown her if she went through with it, and Margaret, for all her rebellion, quite find the courage to defy them completely. But she also wouldn't leave me, wouldn't agree to break up to make them happy. So we got married anyway, without them. It was the bravest thing I'd ever seen her do. I bought us a small house in 1980, a fixer-upper in the Oakland Hills that I could afford and that I could make better with my own hands. Margaret painted the master bedroom blue. We planned to fill that house with children, with life, with noise, the kind of noise I'd grown up with, and that meant love to me. Sarah was born on March 15, 1980. She was perfect, red-faced and furious at the world for daring to push her out into the light, but perfect. I was there in the delivery room, which wasn't as common back then as it is now. Margaret reached out and grabbed my hand during a contraction about an hour before Sarah arrived, and she looked at me with an intensity that scared me a little. "I'm terrified," she whispered, and I held her hand and said, "I know, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Famous last words. Sarah was an easy baby. Margaret was a natural mother in a way that seemed instinctive to her. She'd read all the books, Dr. Spock, La Leche League, all of it, but she also trusted her gut. When Sarah cried, Margaret knew if it was hunger or discomfort or just exhaustion. When Sarah seemed content, Margaret would sit with her for hours, just watching her sleep, her face filled with this tenderness that made me understand something about love that I'd never quite grasped before. Those early months of Sarah's life, I felt like I was living in a golden age. Work was good. I was getting enough jobs that I could hire on Tommy to help me, and we were building something real together. The house was coming together. Margaret was happy. Sarah was healthy and growing. I remember standing in the doorway of Sarah's nursery one night. I'd painted it a soft yellow, and we'd hung a mobile of stars and moons that Margaret had special ordered from an artist in Marin County, and thinking that this was it. This was what I'd been working toward my whole life without even knowing it. I couldn't have been more wrong. Part 2, 1981. 1981 started off fine. Nothing dramatic happened. That's what makes it so hard to talk about, the normalcy of it all, until suddenly it wasn't normal anymore. Sarah was a year old by the time the real trouble started, though I didn't recognize it as trouble at first. Margaret seemed restless. She'd been staying home to take care of Sarah, and I think the isolation was getting to her. She'd mentioned a few times about maybe going back to work part-time, maybe finding a babysitter so she could get back into the art world in some capacity. I should have taken her more seriously. I should have listened harder to the longing in her voice when she talked about the museum, about the shows she wanted to see, about the conversations she missed having with people about things that had nothing to do with baby food or nap schedules. But I was focused on work. We had a mortgage now. I was driven by the idea that I needed to build security for my family, and that meant taking on more jobs, working longer hours, earning more money. I was also beginning to see that Margaret was not her parents' daughter in one key way. She was not naturally satisfied with being a stay-at-home wife. She tried. God knows she tried. But there was this hunger in her that domestic life, at least domestic life in an isolated house in Oakland with a baby and a husband who came home exhausted at 6 p.m., couldn't satisfy. I remember one night in February 1981. Margaret had been having headaches, really bad ones. She was tense all the time. We were lying in bed, and I reached over to rub her shoulders, and she just broke down, started crying in this way that sounded like something inside her was breaking. "I can't do this," she said. "I can't. I love Sarah, I love her so much, but I can't do this for the next 18 years. I feel like I'm disappearing." I held her and said all the wrong things. I told her she was a great mother. I told her that she was lucky to be able to stay home. I told her that it would get easier when Sarah got older. I told her that this was what motherhood was, sacrifice and putting yourself second. I was repeating all the things I'd heard, all the cultural messages about what women were supposed to want and feel, and not a single one of them addressed what she was actually saying. What she was actually saying was, "I'm drowning and I need help." What I heard was, "I'm being ungrateful." She got better for a while. We looked into putting Sarah in a local preschool program a few mornings a week, and Margaret seemed more like herself. She started going to the museum again, volunteering on Friday afternoons when the preschool had Sarah, but there was a kind of distance that had opened between us, nothing obvious. We still had sex. We still went through the motions of being a couple. But it was like a hairline fracture in glass, invisible until the moment when the whole thing shatters. In May 1981, Margaret started going out more. She had a friend from Stanford, a woman named Victoria, and they would go to shows and galleries and restaurants together. She'd get dressed up in ways she hadn't since before Sarah was born. She'd look at herself in the mirror with something like hunger, like she was trying to remember who she was when she wasn't my wife or Sarah's mother. I told myself it was fine. I told myself she deserved to get out, to have a life beyond the house. And I meant it. I genuinely wanted her to be happy. But there was also something in me that felt threatened by it, though I wouldn't have admitted that at the time. She had this energy when she came home from those outings that wasn't directed at me. She'd tell me about the shows, about the conversations, about some artist or curator or interesting person she'd met. But when she talked about these things, I could see that she was already somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't follow. It was in June 1981 when everything began to unravel. Margaret had been talking about an exhibition opening at a gallery in San Francisco, something contemporary, postmodern, the kind of art that made my brain hurt when I tried to understand it. But she was excited about it in a way I hadn't seen her excited about anything in months. She asked if I could stay home with Sarah on the night of the opening, if I could get out of a job I had scheduled. The job was for a good client, someone who paid well and depended on me, but Margaret asked and I said yes. That's the thing I'll never forgive myself for, not that I said yes, but that it took me 3 days to change my mind. 3 days during which Margaret got more and more excited, more and more animated, more and more alive. And then I came home and said I couldn't do it. The client had a problem with a roof repair, and I was the only one who could fix it properly. I remember the look on her face, not anger, just a kind of resignation, like she'd expected exactly this, and the fact that I'd disappointed her exactly as expected was almost worse than if I'd never promised at all. She didn't go to the exhibition, but she started lying. She told me she was going to spend time with Victoria. She'd leave the house on Friday nights and Saturday afternoons, all dressed up, and she'd come home hours later with this flushed look on her face, with stories about galleries and art and coffee shops. And I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was an art person. Victoria was her friend. It made sense. I was 34 years old, and I was blind. I found out the truth in a way that I'll never be proud of. Tommy and I were working on a job in San Francisco, remodeling a bathroom in a Victorian house in Pacific Heights, and we went to get lunch at a cafe on Fillmore Street. And through the window, I saw Margaret. She was sitting across from a man I didn't recognize. They weren't touching, but they didn't need to be. The way they were looking at each other, the way they were leaning toward each other across the table, told me everything I needed to know. Tommy saw my face change. He didn't ask what was wrong. I didn't tell him. I just stood there staring, while the man across from Margaret, tall, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of casual confidence that comes from having never doubted himself a day in his life, reached across the table and tucked a piece of her hair behind her ear. A gesture so tender, so intimate, that I felt something inside me splinter and fall away. I turned around and walked out. I didn't confront her that day. I didn't say anything. I just shut down. That night after Sarah was in bed, I asked Margaret if she'd had a good day. She told me she'd been with Victoria, seen a new exhibition that was really interesting, had coffee at a place in North Beach. All lies, told so smoothly, so completely, that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined what I'd seen, but I hadn't. "Who's the man?" I asked. She went white, just completely white, the color draining from her face like someone had pulled a plug. "What man?" she asked, and her voice was so small. The man you were sitting with at the cafe on Fillmore Street. The one who touches your hair like he knows you. That man." Margaret was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought maybe she'd deny it, come up with some explanation I could latch onto, some story that would allow me to believe that what I'd seen was innocent or misunderstood. But she didn't. "His name is David," she said finally. "He's a curator. We met at the museum." "How long?" I asked. 2 months. 2 months, 2 months of lying. 2 months of me going to work every day, coming home exhausted, believing that my wife was out with a friend, that everything was fine, that our marriage was solid. 2 months of her sharing part of herself with someone else, while I was content to accept whatever version of her I could get. "Have you slept with him?" I asked. I had to know. "Charlie, have you?" "Yes," she said. "Yes, I have." I left that night, went to Tommy's place and stayed on his couch without telling him why. Tommy didn't press. He just gave me a beer and a space to sit in and didn't ask questions. That's the kind of brother he was. I spent 3 days away. I kept thinking I'd know what to do, that clarity would come, that I'd figure out the right response. But what I felt instead was this bottomless confusion mixed with a rage that terrified me, because the rage wasn't just at Margaret, it was at myself. It was at the ways I'd taken her for granted, the ways I'd assumed that my love was enough, that my willingness to provide was enough, that her staying home and being Sarah's mother was enough compensation for giving up all the parts of herself that made her feel alive. The truth was, I'd been selfish. I'd wanted her to fit into the life I was building, and I hadn't been willing to adjust that life to include the things that she needed. And she'd tried to tell me, and I hadn't listened. On the 4th day, I went home. Margaret was a wreck. She'd barely slept. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 4 days, and for the first time I saw clearly what should have been obvious to me all along. She was suffering. Whatever she'd been doing with David, whatever lies she'd been telling, she wasn't happy. She was caught between 2 impossible things, the life she'd committed to and the person she was discovering she actually was. "I don't know what to do," she said when I came through the door. "I don't know how to fix this." And I realized that she was asking me not to punish her, but to help her figure out how to be okay, to help her figure out how to be Margaret in a way that didn't require lies. "Do you love him?" I asked. "I don't know," she said, and that was the most honest thing she'd said to me in months. We talked for hours that night, not about him really, about us, about what had gone wrong, about the fact that she'd been disappearing and I'd been letting her. Because I was too focused on my own vision of what our life should be to notice that she was suffocating. "I want my marriage to work," she said. "I want to be a good mother to Sarah, but I also want to be myself, and those things feel like they're in conflict." "They don't have to be," I said, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. I wasn't sure I knew how to make that true. We decided to try to fix it. Margaret ended things with David. She promised no more lies. I promised to listen better, to pay attention, to adjust my expectations. We went to a marriage counselor, something that was still pretty unusual in 1981, especially for people of our generation and social standing. Our therapist was a woman named Dr. Reeves, and she was good. She helped us see each other more clearly. She helped Margaret articulate that she needed more from her life than just motherhood. And she helped me understand that my love, my loyalty, my willingness to provide, those things weren't enough if they came without genuine attention and respect for who Margaret actually was. For a few months, it seemed like it was working. Margaret seemed happier. She started volunteering at the museum regularly, and I started coming home earlier when I could, spending more time with Sarah. We had sex again with something approaching tenderness. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like we were trying. And then in September 1981, everything fell apart in a way that I still don't fully understand, even now, 42 years later. Margaret left one morning to go to the museum, or so she said. She took a small bag with her, which I thought was odd, but I didn't ask. Sarah was sleeping when she left, and I was in the shower. By the time I realized she was leaving, she was already gone. She left me a note, 4 sentences. I've kept it all these years. I've read it maybe 1,000 times, and I still don't know what it means. Charlie, I'm so sorry. I can't do this. I can't be who you need me to be, and I can't ask you to be who I need you to be. Please take care of Sarah. Please tell her I love her. I love you, but I have to go. She never came back. I filed a missing persons report 2 days later. The police investigated, questioned David, who claimed they'd ended things and hadn't been in contact, interviewed her friends, checked with hospitals and jails and all the places that missing people sometimes turn up, but Margaret had simply vanished. Within a month, she was officially missing and presumed either dead or deliberately absent. There was no evidence of foul play, nothing to suggest that she'd been taken against her will. All signs pointed to the fact that Margaret had simply chosen to leave and had done so deliberately, leaving no forwarding address, no contact information, nothing. For years, I held on to the belief that she'd died, that something bad had happened to her, that she wouldn't have just abandoned Sarah if she'd had a choice. It was easier to believe that, easier to grieve, easier to explain to people, easier to make sense of. But I eventually had to accept the truth. Margaret had left on purpose. She'd made a choice, and that choice was to leave Sarah and me. I've never known why. I've never known where she went or what kind of life she built. I've never known if she had other children, got married again, found happiness. The mystery of her has haunted me for 42 years. Part 3, after she left. When Margaret vanished, Sarah was 17 months old. She didn't understand what had happened. She kept looking for her mother, kept calling Mama, Mama, when she woke up in the morning or when she was hurt or scared. And I had to be both parents, had to explain things that I myself didn't understand. For the first few weeks, I was in shock. I took time off work, and my mother came to stay with us and help take care of Sarah. My mother, whom I hadn't lived with since I was 17, moved into our guest room and took over most of the day-to-day childcare while I sat in the living room, trying to process the fact that my wife had left and trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. The practical questions were pressing. Margaret had no income to speak of, so it wasn't like there was money to figure out, but there were legal questions. I had to establish custody of Sarah. I had to figure out how to make money and take care of a toddler at the same time. I had to, essentially, rebuild my entire life around the fact that I was now a single parent. I've never been good at asking for help. It's one of my defining characteristics, maybe my greatest weakness. But after Margaret left, I had to learn. I had to learn to depend on other people, to admit that I couldn't do it all by myself, to accept that my vision of self-sufficiency was going to have to change. My mother stayed for 3 months. When she finally had to go back to Oakland, my youngest brother needed her help. His marriage was falling apart. I was terrified. I'd gotten used to her presence, her competence, her unwavering belief that we would be okay. But she made me promise that I wouldn't let Sarah go to daycare with some stranger who didn't care about her. She made me promise that I would always put Sarah first, always make sure that Sarah knew she was wanted and loved, always make sure that Sarah never felt like a burden. I made those promises, and I meant them, but I also didn't fully understand what they would cost. I hired a nanny to come during the day, a woman named Rosa who had raised 4 kids of her own and who treated Sarah like she was one of her grandchildren. Rosa was there from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon when I'd come pick Sarah up and we'd have the evenings together. On Fridays, when I had more control over my schedule, I'd pick her up early. On Saturdays and Sundays, it was just the 2 of us. Those early years, Sarah's ages 1 to 5, are a blur to me now, but also they're the clearest years, the ones that shaped everything. I learned to do a lot of things with one hand while holding a small child with the other. I learned to make simple foods, to braid hair, to recognize the different meanings of different kinds of crying. I learned that love wasn't some grand gesture or some big demonstrative thing. It was showing up every single day and doing the small necessary work of keeping another person alive and safe and as happy as possible. Sarah was a smart kid. She was verbal early, funny, curious about everything. She had this serious little face, even when she was happy, like she was always trying to figure out how the world worked. She looked like Margaret, the same dark hair, the same sharp cheekbones, the same serious expression. Looking at her was sometimes like looking at a ghost, like looking at proof that Margaret had been real and had mattered. But Sarah also had parts of me. She had patience with manual work. She loved to help me work on the house, even when she was small enough that helping meant mostly getting in the way. She'd hand me nails with her small, concentrated face or help me sweep by spreading the dust back around. She didn't have her mother's hunger for art and abstract beauty. She was practical like me. She wanted to understand how things worked. She wanted to build. I told her about Margaret, but I told her carefully. I didn't want to lie to her, but I also didn't want to make her feel abandoned. I said that her mother had had to go away, that it wasn't her fault, that her mother loved her, but that sometimes people have to make choices that don't make sense to other people. I said that we had each other, and that was going to be enough. But as Sarah got older, she had questions, and I didn't always have answers. Why did Mommy leave? Where did she go? Doesn't she want to see me? If Mommy loved me, why did she leave? And I would hold her and say I didn't know, and I would feel like I was failing her, like I was failing both of them. Part 4, the growing distance. As Sarah got to be school age, things changed. She became less of a dependent and more of a person with her own internal life, her own thoughts and opinions and feelings that I couldn't fully access. She was a good kid, no trouble at school, good grades, well-behaved, but there was a kind of careful distance between us that I didn't fully understand at the time. Looking back, I think she was trying to protect herself from being abandoned again. If she let herself get too close to me, if she let herself fully depend on me or fully trust that I wouldn't leave too, then she was vulnerable. So she was careful. She was respectful and polite and good, but she was also distant. She had her own world that didn't include me. I was working a lot during those years. I'd built a successful business, and I had more jobs than I could handle alone. I hired a few guys to work for me, and eventually had a small company with about 5 employees. I was making good money, enough to pay off the house, enough to put money away for Sarah's college, enough to feel secure. But the job required my attention. It required that I be present on the job site, that I manage the crew, that I solve problems as they arose. I tried to balance it. I tried to be there for Sarah's school events, her soccer games, her dance recitals, but I was tired a lot of the time. I was preoccupied. I was doing the best I could, but my best often felt like it was coming up short. Sarah noticed. I know she did. Around the time she was 12 or 13, she stopped asking me to come to her soccer games. When I asked why, she just said she didn't really like soccer anyway, even though I'd watched her play it for 3 years and known that wasn't true. She was giving me permission to not be there, was reducing my guilt by lowering her own expectations. And I foolishly, guiltily took it. When Sarah was 14, she started developing opinions about how I'd handled Margaret's disappearance. She'd read something in school, or seen something on TV, or talked to a friend whose parents were divorced, and suddenly she had questions. "Did you really love her?" she asked me once out of nowhere while we were eating dinner. "Of course I did," I said. "Then why didn't you make her stay? Why didn't you try harder to find her?" I tried to explain the legal situation, the fact that you can't force an adult to stay with you, the fact that I had tried to find her. But Sarah wasn't interested in practicalities. "If you'd really loved her," she said, "you would have figured it out." I didn't argue with her. I let her have her accusation. I accepted it as just punishment for all the ways I'd failed. As Sarah got older, she seemed to blame me more and more for the fact that she had no mother. Not that Margaret had left, but that I hadn't been able to prevent it, hadn't been able to make it right, hadn't been able to fill the void that Margaret's absence left. She would make comments about other kids' mothers, about things her friends did with their moms, about how I probably didn't understand what it was like to be a girl, to become a woman, to have specific needs that a father couldn't meet. And she was right. I didn't understand. I tried. I read parenting books aimed at single fathers. I asked Rosa for advice. I listened to Sarah when she tried to tell me things. But there were gaps, real gaps, things I couldn't help her with because of the fundamental fact that I wasn't her mother. By the time Sarah was 16, she was barely speaking to me. She was polite but distant. She did her schoolwork, helped out around the house, stayed out of trouble. But she was closed off from me in a way that broke my heart in small increments. I'd look at her across the dinner table, this person who had my work ethic and Margaret's intensity, and feel like she was a stranger. "Is everything okay?" I asked her once. "Fine," she said. "Why wouldn't it be?" And I didn't push. I told myself that this was normal teenage behavior, that she'd grow out of it, that once she got some distance, she'd understand that I'd done the best I could. The anger really started when Sarah was 17, during her senior year of high school. She came home one day and asked me point blank, "Why didn't you ever really try to find Mom? Why did you just give up?" "I didn't give up," I said, and I could hear the defensiveness in my own voice. "I did everything I could. The police looked, I looked. There was nowhere to look." "She had a name," Sarah said. "She existed. People don't just vanish into nothing. You could have hired a private investigator. You could have tried harder, but you didn't. And I think it's because part of you was glad she was gone." That accusation landed like a punch. "That's not true," I said. "Isn't it? You didn't like that she wanted more than just being our wife and mother. You didn't like that she was unhappy. And then she left, and you got to play the victim, the poor single father doing his best, and everyone felt sorry for you. Everybody saw you as this hero for taking care of me. And Mom became this bad person who abandoned her family. But maybe she had a good reason. Maybe she was just desperate." I didn't know what to say to that, because there was truth in it. I had benefited, in some ways, from the narrative of me as the abandoned father. But I'd also paid a price for it, a price in loneliness and struggle and the constant weight of responsibility. And I'd never asked for that narrative. I'd never asked for Margaret to leave. "Your mother made her own choices," I said finally. "I'm not responsible for those choices. I didn't make her leave." "No," Sarah said, "but you didn't make her want to stay either." Part 5, the years between. After that conversation, something shifted. Sarah, I think, had needed to say those things, and I, at last, had stopped defending myself and had actually heard them. Not agreed with them, but heard them. Sarah graduated from high school in 1998. She got into several good colleges and chose to go to UC Davis to study architecture. I was proud of her, proud that she was following her practical bent, proud that she was moving away from home and building a life of her own. But I was also sad, because I knew that her leaving meant the end of the remaining connection between us. She came home for holidays during college, but the visits were strained. She'd be polite, helpful, but clearly counting the days until she could leave again. I tried to engage with her about her studies, about her life, but she kept things surface level. "How's school?" I'd ask. "Good, I'm enjoying my classes." "What are you working on?" "Just standard first-year stuff." The conversations were like trying to have a connection through a thick pane of glass. I could see her on the other side, but I couldn't reach her. After college, Sarah stayed in the Bay Area. She got a job with an architecture firm in San Francisco, started building a career. She was good at what she did, focused, detail-oriented, committed to quality. In other words, she was everything I'd tried to teach her to be. But we barely saw each other, maybe twice a year, if that. Usually on my birthday or hers, obligatory dinners where we both tried to be pleasant, but mostly just felt uncomfortable. I dated a few times during those years. There was a woman named Patricia that I was with for about 5 years. She was a teacher, divorced, kind. She had kids of her own and understood the weight of single parenthood. I think I could have built a real life with her, but I didn't. I wasn't really ready to open myself up to that kind of vulnerability again, and Patricia could sense it. After 5 years, she moved on to someone who could give her more than I could. I threw myself into work instead. I kept the business going, kept building, kept solving problems with my hands. I bought and renovated several properties, did the work myself, sold them, bought more. By the time I was in my 50s, I'd built a significant amount of wealth, the kind of wealth that I'd never thought would be possible for someone like me, the kind of wealth that allowed me to retire early if I wanted to. But I didn't want to. Work was the thing that made sense to me. Work was the thing I was good at. Sarah's career progressed. I'd see her name on buildings, on projects. I was proud of her even though she didn't know it. I wanted to tell her, wanted to say, I saw the office building you designed in downtown Oakland, and it's beautiful, and it looks like you, but I didn't think she'd want to hear it. We weren't estranged, exactly. We were just distant. We were two people who shared history and blood, but not much else. We were father and daughter in the legal sense, but something in the emotional sense had fractured beyond repair. At least, that's what I believed. Part 6, The Heart Attack. I turned 70 in 2017 and started to feel my age in ways I hadn't before. The physical work was harder. I'd had a few minor health scares, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, things that my doctor said I should take seriously. I cut back on work, sold the business to a younger guy who'd worked for me for 15 years. I told myself I was going to relax, enjoy my retirement, travel maybe. But relaxation didn't suit me. Without work, I didn't know who I was. I spent too much time in my own head, thinking about Margaret, thinking about Sarah, thinking about all the things I'd done wrong. Sarah was married by then, to a woman named Linda. It was a surprise to me, not that Sarah was attracted to women, but that she'd chosen to share her life with someone, and that someone had chosen to share their life with her. They'd gotten married in 2010 in a small ceremony with friends. Sarah hadn't invited me. I found out about it 6 months later when I saw a wedding announcement on Facebook. That hurt, but I'd become used to being hurt by Sarah. I'd made peace with it, or I thought I had. Linda reached out to me a few years later. She sent me a Christmas card with a note. "We'd like you to come visit," she wrote. "Sarah loves you, even if she has a hard time saying it." I didn't know if that was true, but I also didn't see what I had to lose by trying. In December 2019, I drove down to Southern California, where Sarah and Linda had a house. I was terrified. I hadn't spent any extended time with Sarah in years. I didn't know if we'd have anything to talk about, if the silence between us would be comfortable or excruciating. But Sarah met me at the door with something that almost looked like warmth. She hugged me. It was brief, but it was real. And Linda was warm and welcoming in a way that made me see that she'd built a good life, that she'd found someone who loved her and supported her. We spent 4 days together. We didn't solve anything. We didn't have any deep conversations or breakthroughs, but we ate meals together, we watched movies together, we let there be some small connection. It was like we were relearning how to be in the same room as each other. On the last day, Sarah and I took a walk together. We went to a nearby park and we just walked, not talking much. And then Sarah said, "I'm sorry." I asked her what she was sorry for. "For blaming you," she said. "For all those years of blaming you for what happened with Mom. I was angry and I took it out on you, but you didn't deserve that. You were doing the best you could." I cried. I didn't mean to, but I did. I stopped walking and just stood there in the middle of a park in Southern California and cried like a child. "I'm sorry too," I said, "for not listening to you more, for not making more time for you, for not being better at this." "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." We went back and had dinner with Linda, and they invited me to come back soon. I said I would. But 6 months later, I had a heart attack. I was at home, alone, working in the yard, just digging around, not doing anything strenuous, when I felt a tightness in my chest. I thought it was indigestion at first, but then the pain started, a crushing weight that radiated down my left arm, and I knew. I called 911. I made it to the hospital, and I made it through the attack without major damage, though the doctors said I was lucky. They found an artery that was severely blocked and another that was partially blocked. They placed stents, prescribed medications, told me I needed to change my lifestyle. Sarah came up to the hospital and stayed for a week. She and Linda came every day. She held my hand in a way she hadn't since she was a child, and I realized how much I'd wasted, how much time I'd let pass without trying harder to bridge the distance between us. After I got home, Sarah was the one who pushed for me to think about my life more carefully. "You need to figure things out," she said. "You need to be at peace before you can be healthy." So I started therapy, not marriage counseling like Margaret and I had done 40 years before, but individual therapy with a man named Dr. Hayes. And slowly, over the course of many sessions, I started to examine my life, not to excuse myself, but to understand myself. Dr. Hayes helped me see that I'd been carrying guilt for Margaret's departure for 4 decades. I'd blamed myself for not being enough, for not making her happy, for choosing work over her needs. But he also helped me see that I wasn't actually responsible for her choices. Margaret was an adult. She made a decision, and that decision was on her, not on me. But I was responsible for how I'd handled it afterward. I was responsible for how I'd raised Sarah, for the walls I'd put up between us, for the ways I'd let her believe that her mother's abandonment was somehow my fault. "You can't go back and change the past," Dr. Hayes said to me in one session, "but you can acknowledge what happened. You can be honest about your part in it, and you can try to build something different going forward." So I started to think about how I could do that, and I realized that the key was to finally open the box. Part 7, the box. Margaret's final letter. My mother found it after Margaret disappeared. It was in an envelope addressed to me, sealed, placed on the kitchen counter before Margaret left. My mother had given it to me the day she arrived to help, and I'd read it, that 4-sentence note that told me nothing and everything, but there was more. Months after Margaret disappeared, my mother found a box. Small, wooden, with a lock. She found it in the back of the closet in Margaret and my bedroom, hidden behind some boxes of off-season clothing. She brought it to me. "I found this," she said. "I think it's Margaret's. I think she left it for Sarah." Inside the box were letters, many of them, and other things, photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, a whole hidden history that Margaret had prepared before she left. I didn't read them. I opened the box, saw what was in it, and I locked it again. And I put it in my own closet, and I never looked at it again for 42 years. Why, I don't know exactly. Shame, maybe, fear of what the letters said, fear of what Margaret had been thinking, what she'd wanted Sarah to know, fear that if I read them, I'd have to confront things about myself and my marriage that I wasn't ready to confront. So I locked the box, and I locked the letters away with it, and I lived my life. But now, with the heart surgery scheduled, with the knowledge that I could die, that I might not get another chance, I finally forced myself to open it. I went into my bedroom. I was alone in the house. Sarah and Linda had insisted I not stay alone too much, but they'd gone to the store. I opened my closet, and the box was right there, on the top shelf, just where I'd put it 42 years before. I took it down. My hands were shaking. I found the small key that had come with it, and I unlocked it. The first thing I saw was a letter, addressed in Margaret's handwriting, for Sarah, to be given when she is 18. The letter underneath that was addressed, for Charlie, to be read when Sarah has read the first letter. There were photographs underneath, dozens of them, pictures of Margaret from before I knew her, Margaret with her family, Margaret alone, looking happy in a way I wasn't sure I'd ever seen her look. Margaret with other people, friends, I assumed, people who mattered to her. And there were letters, so many letters, some addressed to Sarah, some clearly journals, some that seemed to be addressed to people without names, letters that Margaret had written but maybe never sent. I sat on the bed, and I started to read. The first letter, the one addressed for Sarah, to be given when she is 18, explained things. Explained them in Margaret's voice, in her words, in a way that I'd never had the courage to do myself. Part 8, Margaret's words. "My dearest Sarah, **. If you're reading this, it means you're 18 years old, which means you've likely spent almost your entire life without me. I imagine you have questions. I imagine you hate me, or at least resent me. Both of those feelings would be justified. I want to start by telling you that you were wanted, that you were loved before you were born, and you were loved every day of your life that I spent with you. The choice I made to leave wasn't about you. It was never about you. It was about me, and it was selfish, and I've spent every day since I left regretting it, but I also don't think I had any other choice. You know that your father and I met at a hardware store. Did he ever tell you that he recommended the blue paint to me because he wanted to talk to me, that he made up something about light and space because he saw me struggling and wanted to help? That's your father. He's good at seeing what people need and making that work. He's capable and reliable and honest. I loved him. I still love him. But somewhere in the first year of your life, I became someone I didn't recognize. I lost myself, and I didn't know how to get back. I tried to tell your father, I tried to make him understand, but I didn't know how to explain what was happening to me because I didn't understand it myself. I had been an art history major. I had ideas about the world, about beauty, about culture. I had dreams of curating exhibitions, of contributing something meaningful to the art world. When your father and I got married, I thought I could have both, a career and a marriage. But what happened instead was that I chose the marriage, and the career got smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. I'm not saying this to blame your father. He would have supported me if I'd asked. But I didn't ask, I just disappeared. I became mommy and wife, and the part of me that was Margaret, that was ambitious and curious and needed to feel like I was more than just someone else's support system, that part of me started to die. By the time you were born, I was desperate, not unhappy in the moment-to-moment sense, because I did love you, and loving you brought real joy, but desperate for something more, something that could remind me who I was. That's where David came in. He wasn't the love of my life, and I wasn't planning to run away with him, but he reminded me that I could be more than what I'd become. He saw me as Margaret, not as Charlie's wife or Sarah's mother. He saw the parts of me that I thought had died, and he wanted them. And for a few months, I got to feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But it was built on lies. It was selfish and wrong, and it hurt your father, and it ultimately made me feel worse, not better. When your father found out, we tried to fix it. We went to therapy. We tried to build something new, and I wanted it to work. I really did. But I'd had a glimpse of myself as someone other than a wife and mother, and I couldn't let go of that glimpse. I couldn't settle back into the life I'd committed to. So I left, and I've regretted it almost every moment since. But here's the thing, Sarah, and this is important. I don't regret leaving because I think I made the wrong choice. I regret it because of how it affected you and your father. I regret it because it was selfish and cruel, and there were better ways to handle it. But the core choice, the choice to leave, to walk away from a life that was suffocating me, I don't think that was wrong. I say this because I want you to understand something. Sometimes, in order to save yourself, you have to hurt people you love. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people around you is to be honest about the fact that you're drowning, and to remove yourself from a situation where your drowning will take them down with you. Your father is a good man. He loves you completely and without reservation. He has given you everything he possibly could, but he also loves you in a way that's rooted in duty and responsibility, and I think part of him will always measure his love by how much he sacrifices for you. I wanted to love you differently, not more, just differently. I wanted to love you as a free person, not as someone who felt obligated. And I wasn't sure I could do that if I stayed. So I left and I built a new life, and I tried to become someone I could respect. I'm not sure I succeeded entirely, but I tried. You have choices, Sarah, so many choices. You can be a wife and a mother and a homemaker and be fulfilled by that if that's what you choose. You can be an artist or an architect or a scientist or a teacher or something no one's ever thought of. You can be happy in one place, or you can spend your whole life moving. You can love someone forever, or you can love someone for a season and then let them go. You can make yourself small to fit into someone else's life, or you can demand space for yourself. But whatever you choose, choose with your eyes open. Don't let anyone, not me, not your father, not anyone, make you choose blindly. I loved you when I left. I love you now, even though I don't know you anymore. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to love you in the way that you deserved. I'm sorry I was too afraid to ask your father for what I needed, and I'm sorry I didn't have the strength to stay and work it out. Those are my failures. But don't let my failures teach you that it's wrong to need things. Don't let my leaving teach you that asking for more is selfish. Don't let what I did teach you to make yourself smaller. Be brave, Sarah. Be honest. Take care of yourself, and forgive me when you can. All my love, asterisk. Margaret. I read that letter 3 times, and I wept. I wept for what Margaret had lost, and for what Sarah had lost, and for what I had failed to give them both: understanding, space, wisdom. I wept for the fact that I'd kept these letters locked away, that Sarah had never gotten to read them, that Margaret's voice had been silenced for 42 years. And I wept for myself, for the ways I'd carried guilt that I didn't deserve, for the ways I'd let Margaret's choice to leave define everything that came after. Part 9, Truth and Consequences. I read the other letters too, the journals that Margaret had kept, the letters she'd written to her mother, to her friends, to herself. Over and over again, the same themes emerged: loneliness, desperation, love mixed with suffocation, the sense that she was disappearing into a role she'd never chosen. There were letters too that seemed to be addressed to me, though Margaret never explained who they were for. I keep thinking about the moment when he recommended the blue paint. I keep thinking about the fact that he saw me, really saw me, in that moment in the hardware store. And I think that's part of why I'm so angry now, because I feel like he stopped seeing me. Once we got married, once we had Sarah, I became a supporting character in his life story, and I forgot how to be the protagonist of my own. I don't blame him, he loves me, but love isn't always enough when the person being loved is disappearing. There were letters that described David in clinical detail, neither praising nor condemning him, just acknowledging that he was a person she'd briefly connected with, not the villain that I'd perhaps imagined him to be. And there were letters describing where Margaret had gone, what she had done with her life after she left. I went to Los Angeles. I didn't know anyone, had no plan, just drove south on a feeling. I worked as a docent at a museum, then as a freelance curator, then I eventually opened my own small gallery space in an arts district that isn't very well known. It's not fancy, but it's mine. I decide what shows go up. I decide what artists get a platform. I have a life that is mine. I'm not happy in some absolute sense. I'm lonely a lot. I think about Sarah every day, but I'm also alive in a way I wasn't before. I get to be Margaret, and that matters. Margaret had never gotten in touch with Sarah. She'd never tried to contact Charlie after she left. She'd simply vanished and built a life far away, checking in on Charlie and Sarah through the news, through the internet once the internet existed, never reaching out, but never quite able to let go. The last letter in the box wasn't addressed to anyone. It was dated 1990, 9 years after Margaret had left. It seemed to be a reflection, a kind of accounting of what her choice had cost. Sometimes I wonder if there was a middle path, if I could have stayed and fought for space for myself, if I could have insisted on my needs in a way that was clear and unambiguous rather than drowning and then vanishing. But I'm not sure that middle path existed for me. I'm not sure I was capable of being that brave. I'm not sure I could have stayed and kept myself intact. What I do know is that by leaving, I saved myself. And by saving myself, I forced Charlie to become someone he might not have become otherwise, a dedicated father, a person who learned how to prioritize another human being above his own comfort. I forced Sarah to become strong in ways she might not have had to be. I wonder if that was a gift or a curse, probably both. I sat there in my bedroom, holding 42 years of unsent love and unshared truth, and I thought about what I needed to do. Part 10, Telling Sarah. I called Sarah. I didn't prepare what I was going to say. I just called her. I need you to come over, I said. There's something you need to see. She was there in an hour, Linda with her. They found me sitting in the living room with the box open on the coffee table, the letters spread out. What is this? Sarah asked. Your mother left these, I said, before she disappeared. She left them for you. I kept them, I locked them away, and I never told you. Sarah's face went white. She came and sat down next to me, and she looked at the letters, and she started to cry. Why didn't you give these to me? She asked. Because I was ashamed, I said, because I was afraid of what they would say, because I was carrying guilt about the whole thing, and I thought if you read them, you'd blame me more than you already did. I was selfish, and I'm sorry. Sarah picked up the first letter, the one addressed to her, to be given when she turned 18. She was 41 years old. She'd been waiting for this letter for 23 years without knowing it existed. "May I read it?" she asked. "Of course," I said. She started reading, and as she read, her face moved through shock to sadness to something like recognition. When she got to the part where Margaret talked about Sarah being an architect, about Margaret seeing herself in Sarah's practical bent, she started to cry harder. She read the entire letter without stopping. When she finished, she set it down and she looked at me. "Did you read this?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "last night." "And what do you think?" she asked. "I think your mother was braver than I ever gave her credit for," I said. "I think she was also more honest about herself than I was. I think I spent 40 years being angry at her for leaving and feeling guilty about the ways I'd contributed to her unhappiness, and I never once considered that she might have had a valid reason for the choice she made." "Do you still love her?" Sarah asked. I thought about that. 40 years is a long time. It's long enough to stop loving someone in the romantic sense. It's long enough for that kind of love to curdle into something else, resentment, anger, indifference. But I didn't feel any of those things when I thought about Margaret. "Yes," I said, "I don't think that stops, really. I think the nature of it changes, but I don't think the capacity to love someone, even after they've hurt you, really goes away." Sarah picked up another letter. This one was Margaret's journal, entries from the months before she left. "I want to read all of these," she said. "I want to understand who she was, who she is, I guess, if she's still alive." "I looked for her," I said. "Years ago, I hired a private investigator in the 1990s. The investigator found records of her opening a gallery in Los Angeles in 1982, but by the time I had the information, I didn't know what to do with it. I was afraid, I was angry, and I thought she'd chosen to disappear, and I had to respect that choice." Sarah was quiet. Then she said, "I need to look for her. I need to see if I can find her. I need to know if she's alive, and if she is, I need to meet her." "Okay," I said, "I'll help you if you want." And so began the search for Margaret. Part 11, The Search. Sarah and Linda hired a new private investigator, someone with access to modern databases and the internet. The investigator's first lead came from art gallery records in Los Angeles. Vanishing Point Gallery, run by Margaret Hunnam, from 1982 to 2003. After that, the trail went cold. The investigator found some mentions in art publications, reviews of shows, announcements of exhibitions. Margaret had built something real in Los Angeles. She'd worked with contemporary artists, had developed a reputation for discovering new talent, had created a space for experimental art that mattered. And then, in 2003, she'd closed the gallery. After that, there was almost nothing. "She might have just stopped," the investigator said. "People do that sometimes. They walk away from everything and disappear. Or maybe she got married, changed her name, lived quietly under the radar." Sarah and Linda decided to go to Los Angeles. They spent a weekend going to galleries, talking to people in the art community, trying to find someone who might have known Margaret. It was like hunting for a ghost. But then, in a small gallery in Silver Lake, a woman recognized the name. "Vanishing Point Gallery," she said. "Yeah, I remember that place. Margaret was amazing, such a vision." "Do you know where she went?" Sarah asked. "After she closed the gallery? No idea, but wait. There was someone who used to come to her shows all the time. An older woman, maybe Margaret's age by now, very elegant, dark hair. She and Margaret seemed close. They asked more questions and eventually got a name, Diane. Just Diane, no last name, which was frustrating, but it was a lead. It took another 2 months to track down Diane. She turned out to be Diane Rothschild, Margaret's friend from Stanford, the one Margaret had mentioned in her journals as her closest confidant. And miraculously, the investigator found her in the Bay Area, not far from where Charlie and Sarah lived. Part 12, Diane. Sarah called Diane one afternoon in February 2026, 76 days before my surgery. She didn't explain who she was right away. She just asked if Diane had known someone named Margaret Hunnam. There was a long silence on the phone. "Who is this?" Diane asked finally. "My name is Sarah Hunnam. I'm Margaret's daughter." Another silence, and then Diane said, "I'll meet with you, but not alone. I want someone with me." They agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Oakland, neutral territory. Sarah brought Linda. She brought the box of letters, the photographs, the journals. Diane was 88 years old. She was beautiful in the way that some older people are elegant, with silver hair worn in a neat bun, with kind eyes behind reading glasses. When she saw Sarah, she reached out and touched her face. "You look like her," she said. "Around the eyes, and the way you're holding yourself, that's very Margaret." "You know where she is?" Sarah asked. It wasn't a question really, it was an assumption. "I do," Diane said. "I've always known. I've been in touch with her for all these years. Not regularly, but we've stayed connected." "Is she alive?" Sarah asked. "Yes," Diane said, "she is. She's 87 years old, and she lives in Northern California now. She's not in great health, but she's alive." Sarah started to cry. Linda reached for her hand. "Why didn't she ever try to contact me?" Sarah asked. "After I turned 18, after I became an adult, why didn't she ever try?" "Because she was afraid," Diane said gently. "Because she thought she'd lost the right to have you in her life. Because she thought you'd hate her, and she didn't think she could bear that." "I would have wanted to know her," Sarah said. "I spent my whole life angry at her, and I would have wanted to know her." Diane nodded. "I know, and I think she knows that now too, which is why." "Which is why what?" Sarah asked. "Which is why she's been trying to figure out how to reach you. She's been sick, Sarah. She's got cancer. She's had surgery, she's doing chemo, and she's been thinking about you a lot." Sarah looked at Linda, then back at Diane. "I want to see her," she said. "I want to meet her." "Okay," Diane said. "I'll make it happen." Part 13, before surgery. That was how things stood the day before my surgery. Sarah told me about the meeting with Diane. She told me that Margaret was alive, that she was sick, that she wanted to meet Sarah. "I'm going to go see her," Sarah said. "After your surgery, after you're out of recovery and on your way to healing, I'm going to drive out and meet my mother." I felt something shift in my chest, not pain, just a seismic recalibration of things. Margaret, after 42 years, was going to be a person in Sarah's life again, and I was going to have to be okay with that. "What will you say to her?" I asked. "I don't know," Sarah said. "I'll figure it out when I see her." "She loves you," I said. "In her way, she's always loved you." Sarah nodded. I know that now, because I read her letters." She paused. "I'm not angry at you anymore," she said, "for keeping the letters. I understand now why you did, and I forgive you." I held my daughter, and I let myself cry. Not because I was afraid of the surgery, I wasn't anymore, but because something that had been broken for 40 years was finally, slowly, beginning to mend. The night before the surgery, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, thinking about Margaret, about Sarah, about all the years I'd carried guilt for things that weren't entirely my fault, about all the ways I'd been less generous, with myself, with Margaret, with Sarah, than I should have been. I got up and went to the room where I'd kept Margaret's letters. I took out the last journal, the one where she was reflecting on the choices she'd made. I reread the parts where she wondered if there had been a middle path. I think there probably was. I think if I'd been braver, and if Margaret had been braver, we might have found a way to stay together and both be ourselves. But that's not what happened. What happened instead is that we both made the choices we made, and we both carried the consequences, and now, 42 years later, some version of healing was finally possible. The surgery was scheduled for 7 a.m. Sarah came to the hospital with me. Linda was there too. My brother Tommy came. Even Rosa, the nanny who'd helped raise Sarah, came, now in her 90s, and still bright-eyed and clear-minded. Before they wheeled me back, Sarah held my hand. "I love you, Dad," she said. "I hope you know that." "I do," I said, "and I love you, I always have. I just wasn't always good at showing it." "I know," she said. "I know that now." Epilogue. 1 year later. I'm recovering well from the surgery. The doctors say my heart is stronger than they expected. That I took the warning seriously and made changes. I've cut back on some of the physical work, started taking medications, started walking more and pushing myself less. I'm 74 now, and I feel 74, which is to say that I feel my age, but not in a way that's debilitating. Sarah did go to meet Margaret. She drove out on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after my surgery, and she met her mother for the first time in 42 years. I'll let her tell you what happened. It's her story to tell, and I wouldn't do it justice. But what I know is that they sat together for 7 hours, and they talked and they cried, and they started to know each other. Margaret showed Sarah the gallery she'd run, the photographs of shows, the artists she'd worked with. She told Sarah about her life, about the choices she'd made, about the regrets and the things she was proud of. And Margaret talked about me. She told Sarah that she'd loved me, that she'd been thinking about me for 42 years, that she was sorry for the pain she'd caused, but not sorry for the choice she'd made to save herself. Sarah came back to Northern California with a fuller picture of who her mother was. Not a perfect person, not a villain, not a saint. Just a woman who'd made choices and lived with consequences and built a life that mattered to her. Margaret died 3 months later. The cancer came back, more aggressive the second time, and she didn't fight it. Sarah was with her when she died. She held her mother's hand and told her that she loved her, that she forgave her, that she understood now. At the funeral, which was attended by artists and friends from Margaret's gallery, Sarah gave a eulogy. She talked about how her mother had been brave enough to leave, brave enough to be honest about her limitations, brave enough to try to build a life that was authentically hers. She talked about how Margaret had written letters that she never sent, but that those letters had, in the end, changed everything. And she talked about me. She said, "My father raised me alone and he did the best he could. He was a good father, a practical father, not always an emotionally available father, but someone who showed up, who tried, who built a life for me that was secure and stable. And when I was angry at him for not being able to fill the void that my mother left, he didn't fight back or make excuses. He just loved me anyway, and he waited for me to understand." It was the most generous thing anyone had ever said about me in public, and it made me cry. After the funeral, Sarah and I went to lunch, just the two of us. "I'm glad you're still here," she said. "So am I said. "I'm glad you finally opened the box," she said. "I'm glad you had the courage to do that before the surgery." "I almost didn't," I said. "I almost let 42 years go to the grave with me." "But you didn't," Sarah said, "and that's what matters." We talked about Margaret. We talked about what Sarah had learned from meeting her, from reading her letters, from understanding her story in her own words rather than through the filter of absence. "I think I'm more like her than I realized," Sarah said. "I think the part of me that's driven, that's ambitious, that wants to create something real, that comes from her, and the part that's practical and stable and committed, that comes from you." "You got the best of both of us," I said. "Maybe," Sarah said, "or maybe I got the complicated parts of both of you, and I'm just learning how to make sense of them." I laughed. "That's probably true." The final reckoning. I'm writing this down now, a year and a half after opening the box, because I want to make sure that if something happens to me, the story gets told. Not Margaret's version, that's in her letters, for anyone who wants to read it. Not Sarah's version, that's hers to tell in whatever way makes sense to her. But my version, the version of a man who made mistakes, who carried guilt he didn't deserve, who finally learned how to forgive himself and the people he loved. The truth is, I spent 40 years thinking that Margaret's leaving was my fault. I spent 40 years believing that if I'd just been better, been more attentive, been less focused on work, she would have stayed. And I spent those same 40 years not fully present to Sarah, not fully available to her, because I was so busy trying to make up for the void that Margaret had left. What I finally understand now is that Margaret didn't leave because of me. She left because she was drowning and she couldn't figure out how to ask for help. She left because she was brave enough to save herself, even though it cost her everything else. And that's not a failure. That's not a tragedy, at least not entirely. That's just a human being making a choice and living with consequences. And Sarah didn't suffer because her mother left. Sarah suffered because I made her mother's absence into this big tragic thing, this evidence of my failure, instead of giving her the tools to understand that her mother's leaving was about Margaret's needs and Margaret's journey, not about Sarah's worth. If I could go back and talk to my 34-year-old self, the night Margaret left, I would tell him some things. I would tell him, your wife is not your property. She doesn't belong to you. If she needs to leave, that's her choice to make. And yes, it will hurt. Yes, it will complicate everything. Yes, your daughter will grow up asking questions you don't have answers to, but your job is not to prevent her from leaving or to make her regret it. Your job is to take care of your child and to understand that other people's pain is not your responsibility to fix. I would tell him, you will feel like a failure. You will carry guilt that isn't yours to carry, but that guilt will eat you alive if you let it, and it will also poison your relationship with your daughter. You need to learn to forgive yourself, not because you did nothing wrong, but because you did the best you could with the information you had. And I would tell him, the woman you loved, the woman who left, she was always her own person. She was never yours to keep. And if you can somehow manage it, if you can manage to love her anyway, to see her journey as valid even when it takes her away from you, then maybe you can teach your daughter that it's okay to be a person, fully realized and autonomous, even when that has costs to the people around you. I don't know if I learned these lessons in time to make a real difference. Sarah and I didn't rebuild our relationship until she was in her 40s. That's a lot of years wasted, but we did rebuild it, and I think that counts for something. Margaret used to say that the kindest thing we can do for people is to be honest, to say what we need, to ask for help, to admit when we're drowning instead of just vanishing. She wasn't always brave enough to do that. She vanished instead of asking. But she wrote it down in letters, and eventually those letters got read, and they changed things. So I'm writing this down too, for Sarah, for Linda, for anyone who might ever care about this story. I'm writing it down because the truth needs to be said, needs to be witnessed, needs to exist in the world in all its complexity and failure and eventual grace. I was a man who did the best he could. I was a man who loved, who tried, who failed, and who eventually learned. I was a man who was raised by someone who believed that work was everything, so I made work my life. I was a man who didn't know how to ask for help, so I struggled alone for 40 years. I was a man who carried guilt and shame and regret. But I was also a man who, when he finally had to confront his mortality, found the courage to open a locked box and read the truth, hard as it was. And I was a man who, in the end, learned to forgive. Not Margaret, not exactly. I don't think forgiveness is quite the right word when it comes to Margaret. She didn't do anything to me that required forgiving in the sense of releasing anger. She did what she had to do, and I understand that now. But I learned to forgive myself, and I learned to forgive the limitations that I had as a father, as a husband, as a human being. I learned to forgive the younger version of me who didn't know any better, who thought that love meant ownership and that sacrifice meant love. And I learned to accept that life is messier than any story I could tell about it. It doesn't have neat conclusions. It doesn't have clear villains and heroes. It has people doing the best they can, making mistakes, trying to find their way towards something that feels like meaning or peace or happiness. Final words. The surgery was successful. My heart is strong. The doctors say that if I'm careful, if I keep taking my medications and walking regularly and managing my stress, I could live another decade or more. That's a long time. That's time to know Linda better, to watch Sarah build her architecture career, to take Sarah's future children, when and if that happens, and tell them stories about their grandmother and their grandfather and what it means to be human in all its beautiful, flawed complexity. Sarah and I are talking more now. We have dinner together most weeks. We talk about work and life and architecture and philosophy. We don't talk much about Margaret, not because it's taboo, but because we both feel like we've said most of what needs to be said about her. We know her story now in a way that we didn't before, and that knowledge has freed us both. I never found out what happened to David, the man who Margaret left me for, I don't think I need to know. His role in this story ended a long time ago, and whatever his life became, it's none of my business. What matters is that he was a person who reminded Margaret that she could be more than what she'd become. In that sense, I owe him something, not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement. Without him, Margaret might have stayed and slowly died inside. And if she'd done that, I'm not sure Sarah would have learned the lessons that she eventually did learn. Rosa, the nanny, came to visit me last month. She's 94 now, and she's still sharp as a tack. She brought me cookies that she'd baked herself. "You did good," she told me. "You took care of Sarah. You gave her a home and stability and love. That's all a parent can do." "I felt like I failed her," I said, "for so long." "You're a man," Rosa said. "Men always think they fail, but the question is not whether you were perfect. The question is whether you showed up. And you did. You showed up every single day." I think that's right. I think that's what it comes down to in the end, not whether you're perfect, not whether you understand everything, not whether you make all the right choices. It's whether you show up. It's whether you do the work. It's whether you keep trying, even when you're scared and confused and carrying more guilt than you should have to carry. I showed up. I wasn't always good at it, and I wasn't always present in the way that I should have been, but I showed up. And maybe, in a life, that's enough. The locked box is open now. Margaret's letters are no longer hidden. Sarah has digitized them, made copies, filed them away safely. Diane, who is 89 and still going strong, has a copy. Linda has a copy. I have a copy. Margaret's story is out in the world now, not in a way that she chose, not in a way that she controlled, but in a way that allows her voice to be heard, allows her choices to be understood, allows the people who loved her to know who she really was. And my story, this story, is here too. The story of a man who loved imperfectly, who failed spectacularly, who carried guilt longer than he needed to, but who eventually found his way to some kind of peace. I don't know if I'm going to be here to read this story when I'm 84 or 90. I don't know if I'll get the 10 more years the doctors are predicting. But I know that this story will be here, and maybe someday Sarah will read it again, and maybe someday she'll tell her own children about their grandfather and what he learned about love and failure and grace. And maybe, somehow, that will matter.